Brandeis Bardeen Institute board treated him miserably. You know who else treated him miserably? Disney. When Disney took over KBC Radio, decided the only thing that mattered were ratings. They put in a general manager who said, none of this high-quality talk stuff. We've got to go down in the gutter. Thought I was going to be fired. I wasn't prepared to do everything this wanted me to do. It was a very tense. And he says, it cost him my TV career because I wouldn't do the stuff they are. This is his grievance narrative. Through the use of public opprobrium laws and lawsuits, Americans today are less free than at any time since the abolition of slavery. And Dennis says, if there is a real fascist threat to America, it comes from the left, whose appetite for state power is essentially unlimited. And remember when Dennis said that Keith Ellison should not be allowed to be sworn into Congress on a Quran, but must use the American. Dennis wrote, it is not I, it is Keith Ellison who is engaged in disuniting this country. He can still help reunite it by simply bringing both books to his ceremonial swearing in. Had he originally announced that he would do that, I would have written a different column filled with praise of him, and there would be a lot less cursing and anger in America. So those damn black Muslims like Keith Ellison who are disuniting America. Right, so I'm using the barometer of these blokes, Christopher Cavanaugh and Matthew Brown. Here they are speaking. Rene D'Aresta about online ecosystems. Gravel
of that issue too, whereby when we are critical about like the various anti-vax messages or that kind of thing, a lot of the times people presented that we uncritically ingest the information from any institutional source, which is not the case. I guess that I simply...
Chris isn't an NPC. He's sure of it.
No, it doesn't... Yeah, in any case, it's a bit of a bugbear because my stance, possibly the same, I think, as most reasonable people, is be critical of all the information you consume. Like, you know, but weigh it in terms of the relevant expertise that is associated with whoever's delivering it. So I'm kind of curious about that issue. As you just mentioned before, you were embroiled in a controversy recently, primarily because Michael Schellenberger framed you as the leader of the censorship industry, right? And, you know, there were releases of messages back and forth, and there was various Substack articles targeting you and that kind of thing, and accusations that you were involved with the CIA and that this had been uncovered and so on. So I'm curious in that respect, given that that's going to happen, but just how do you address that? You know, if you're involved in the kind of work that you are, that you will almost inevitably become part of the conspiracy nexus of the institutions trying to silence free thinkers, especially if you're looking for like programs to push back against anti-vaccine disinformation or that kind of thing. I know you've been on Rogan, you engage with heterodox speakers, but it didn't really prevent you from becoming a villain in that ecosystem. So yeah, I'm curious about.
Oh well, not from that was sort of funny. Like what people say to you in the DMs is very different, of course, than what they say, you know, in public and Twitter sometimes. So I don't think it was the entire heterodox community that kind of went down that particular rabbit hole. But you know, it's a really interesting question. So first of all, I think just to point to one particular thing, the quote unquote censorship industrial complex, that was not based on anything sourced to the Twitter files. That was based on a man named Mike Benz, who was a Trump appointee who'd been a speechwriter for Ben Carson. He spent a couple months at State, and then he started calling himself the Foundation for Freedom Online, right? So he created a website and he started blogging. And he took our report on the 2020 election. And what we did during the 2020 election was we had analysts, a bunch of students, who would kind of pay attention to narratives specifically related to claims about voting. Not Hunter Biden's laptop, completely out of scope, just claims about voting. And a lot of the claims about voting really became very linked, particularly by President Trump, to delegitimizing the election. So a lot of it was mail-in balloting is fraud, you know, this is fraud, that is fraud, all these allegations of fraud, completely unsubstantiated. And so we were in touch with state and local election officials. And so when we would see some of these narratives that would go viral, we communicated with them. Sometimes they sent them to us. Sometimes we pinged them and we said, hey, you know, what's the story here? Or, hey, this is kind of breaking out. You know, maybe you should respond. There was no collusion to take down tweets. But this man, Mike Benz, took our report and ran in a part where at the end we say, we just went and, you know, after the election was over, after January 6th and everything, we took the hashtags of very, very highly viral things, right? Things where there had been a whole lot of activity. And we pulled down all of the tweets from Twitter historical data about them, giving us about 20. Mike Benz either, let's say charitably, misread that part of the methodology and said that we had censored 22 million tweets, and then that we had censored every narrative that had these hashtags in it. And then in the course of doing so, we had censored billions of tweets, silencing millions of voices, targeting conservatives, et cetera, et cetera. So Benz begins to write these blog posts, and he reframes himself as a cybersecurity expert. I think Schellenberger calls him like the head of cybersecurity at State Department on Rogan. It's complete nonsense. But that is where all of those claims come from. So there is no evidence of any of that in the Twitter files. That's kind of the most remarkable thing about this entire situation. But based on that man's kind of blog posts and his sort of misreading of how we worked and what we looked at and what we did, Schellenberger really ate it up, and he just kind of regurgitated it under oath to Congress. And I was very surprised by that, I have to say, because I thought, you know, surely I've been engaging with him one-on-one because he reached out in December. He wanted to know about content moderation. He didn't even know the basics, but he was already writing about it. And so I just, you know, I talked to him, I engaged with him off the record for months. But again, when it came right down to it, rather than reaching out to me and saying, hey, I've got this guy who I connected with who's briefing.
So looking at Pete Hegseth of Fox News on the screen right now, he's like a younger version of Dennis.
me for my congressional testimony, he says you censored 22 million tweets. Nobody ever asked me that question, right? So it was a really remarkable kind of construct in which, and I get it. He's got a Substack. He needs to make money. He needs to grow his audience. And the way that conspiracy theories work, you have to create a villain because, I just explained it to you, and it probably sounds very convoluted, very like, red string on a whiteboard kind of meme, right? It takes a long time to debunk point by point all of the crazy allegations in a conspiracy theory. For me, it's an order of magnitude more effort to refute the bullshit. Whereas for him, all he has to say is, she censored 22 million tweets. She's the head of the censorship industrial complex. And people who are not critical, haven't read my work, don't know who I am, don't know that I've advocated against takedowns for the better part of 5 years now, are like, oh yeah, censor, And so that's how the bespoke reality works, unfortunately. And that's
So this is a conversation between three sinister leftists, right? This woman's the leftist. The two hosts are leftists, right? And yet they're having a completely reasonable, thoughtful, nuanced conversation that is worth listening to.
That's how, we're not surprised by it. I'm not surprised.
And the right wing is in this story, the idiots, right? There are a lot of idiotic people on the right and on